We want to bring in friend of the program and national security expert and CEO of Global Risk Intelligence and Planning, Hal Kempfer. Thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. Of course, certainly big news when you revolve around this and the Pentagon making this announcement that an arrest has been made. Just give me your first reaction. What are we learning about this and how big of a deal is it, Hal?
Well, Andy, the last couple of days, there's been a profile, if you will, that's been circulated. There was a big interview by the Washington Post, and the New York Times has some very insightful reporting on this that has been kind of breaking things very quickly in terms of what this is. But they were narrowing it down. What came out today, though, is that the FBI had him under surveillance for at least a couple of days. And when I saw this thing, when it first came out, like many others, we're looking at it and we're thinking our first thoughts are, is this a foreign intelligence service, most likely the Russians, or maybe one of these famous Russian hacking groups? But it didn't quite fit that. And one of the reasons, as more information was being looked at and assessed, there were a lot of reports in there that was very clear that Russia would not want out because it would not be in Russian interest to have these out. And some of them actually would be somewhat detrimental to Putin himself. So that was a bit of a head scratcher. So it started to look less like a penetration and more like a leak, more along the lines of, say, a Chelsea Manning or a Edward Snowden or something along those lines. And there's been a lot of speculation that it might be someone younger, someone naive who had access to a classified facility, obviously did something which made sense because if you use a USB drive or stuff, those are things that are tracked pretty closely with any classified facility. So he printed out documents, and as far as we could tell, he folded them up or stuck them in his pockets and carried them physically out of the facility and then took pictures of them. But there were so many things that were in those pictures. The Gorilla Glue, the magazine in the background, and even with the wood grain on the table, if you use modern AI-enabled systems, you can figure out what kind of table it was. A lot of things, the time frame in which it was, the array of documents, all of these things can be used to really narrow down who it was. Yeah. And so when it finally happened, I wasn't surprised. Although I will say one thing, there is a question I have. Some of the documents looked to be doctored. They were inflating the Ukrainian casualties and decreasing or trying to limit, create an impression that the Russian casualties are much lower. And that's still an unanswered question, even with this arrest and everything else. Where did those come from? How did those get into the mix?
Yeah, that is a question, for sure.
I don't know.
Yeah, that's a question. I think they're going to be asking a lot of questions to Jack Teixeira there, the 21-year-old. And I think one of the first things that comes to my mind, especially when you talk about an Air National Guardsman, just potentially the low rank and the low age as a 21-year-old. How does a person like this get their hands on such classified material?
Well, it joined the military services, pretty much. We recruit out of high schools. And I have been in charge. I'm a retired intelligence officer, military intelligence officer, and I've been in charge of a number of, SCIFs, if you will. These are highly classified facilities, and the service members, whether they're Marines, sailors, airmen, soldiers, Coast Guardsmen, whatever they are, they tend to be very young, and in many cases they might be in their late teens, early 20s. That's fairly normal. In his case, one of the challenges they have when we recruit them when they're that young and we're doing their background check, when you're 18 or 19 or 17 years old, and we're looking to see if there's any indicators of a possible compromise or something like that, they're so young. There's really not much to look at in terms of their background because they literally just grew up. They were in high school and now they're joining the service. So there's not a lot of background to look at. It really harkens back to the issue in the 70s with the famous Falcon and the Snowman case in Los Angeles, where they made the movie. He was so young. His father was an FBI special agent or retired FBI special agent. He was so young that when they were doing his background investigation for his clearance, there wasn't much background to investigate. And so when they talked to his father, he's retired FBI, their family friends were all people, who had clearances or were highly trusted. So he kind of got his clearance based on that association. Whatever thoughts were floating around his mind and stuff wasn't quite clear. And he may have taken on some of these more extreme ideas. It's reported that he had strong anti-government beliefs and things like that. He may have taken on these more extreme ideas since he initially got his clearance. Sure. So one of the things we're going to be looking at, it comes up periodically every time one of these cases comes forth, is we need to be looking at cleared individuals very closely between their normal investigative periods. We look at you very intensely, and then you're in your job. And then some years later, we look at you intensely again, and you're in your job. And this is one where he clearly fell between the two wickets. Yeah. He got his initial one, but he wasn't up for his periodic investigative review. And we probably need to be looking at him very closely. And there's a famous story about Chelsea Manning, who was, having all kinds of issues. And they basically, within that particular setting, they said, look, the guy's got a lot of problems, but he's got a skill set we absolutely need. So we got to hold on to him. And of course, we paid for that because, as it turns out, he ended up dumping a bunch of highly classified documents on the internet. So we got to watch individuals that have these clearances very closely.
Yeah, and like you said, there are a lot of elements that make it feel like it's out of a TV show or a movie here, just with all the elements involved. I do have to ask you, because obviously a lot of it has to do with the online nature of it and the chat group that it was in and whatnot. What more do we know about that, and maybe how closely are investigators at the DOJ and the DOD looking into this whole group as a whole?
Well, they're going to be looking at everybody in this chat group very closely, and I don't think this is over by any means. I think the investigation is still very much ongoing, and I'm not saying this is done. They've made one arrest. There may be more arrests coming. There may be others who knew things or participated with this group. So we're going to find out more as this is going on, and typically these investigations tend to be like a big net. And they cover a lot of different things because they're trying to figure out everything that was compromised and all the individuals involved. And certainly we're going to be looking very closely to see if that particular group, that chat group, could have been infiltrated by a foreign intelligence service who was exploiting this leak, if you will, and maybe manipulating individuals within that group too. One of the things, though, is these online gaming chat boards. That's been a known challenge because they are so ubiquitous online. There's so much gaming going online, and all these communications going. And certainly, I have seen numerous counterintelligence training videos and things that talk about the vulnerability of these online chat groups and how they exchange information. They can only do so much because there are certain privacy protections which go with certain communications, and there's an expectation of privacy. So it's not like they can just go in there and scoop up everything. That scooping up thing was kind of what Snowden set him off, was that there were broad capabilities to do things, and there certainly are, but there are also some very strict rules on what can be collected and how it can be collected. Yeah. So it's a challenge, and it really goes back to people. You got to watch your personnel, and it goes back to leadership. You got to know your people. You got to know what they're thinking. And somewhere in this, we're going to find out, inevitably, that somebody in his unit, in his command, saw something or saw many times that there was something wrong with this guy. And for whatever reason, they didn't say anything. They didn't report it. Sometimes there's that peer pressure thing. I don't want to get him in trouble. I don't want to do this. I don't want to be seen as a snitch, all sorts of different things. And that's where we kind of have to sort of bust through and say, hey, look, this is national security. The implications are too great. It may make you uncomfortable. I don't care. I'm a Marine. The Marine Corps is all about making people uncomfortable. That from the first day you show up, we're really good at it. I think we're the best on the planet at it. But it's to get people to do something when they're uncomfortable. and they're going to be looking really hard at what was going on in that command climate that would allow something like this to go unnoticed.
And you mentioned implications, because that is what we're talking about here with classified documents, classified information, and what they have an effect on the real world, especially surrounding the war in Ukraine. Maybe how dangerous is a leak like this, especially when it's relating to a conflict like that between two powers there that are kind of back and forth there. What kind of danger does this threat pose?
Well, potentially, it's a great danger, because the Russians have been looking at these documents, and the mill bloggers and ultranationalists have been harping in Russia. It said the Americans have penetrated our services, are looking at everything. We have no secrecy in Russia, and they have been harping on this, which really undermines Putin, because they are his strongest constituency, politically speaking, that helps him. Even though he's an autocrat, he still has to play some level of politics like everybody else. So that's unnerved him. But with that, the Russian intelligence services, the FSB and others are looking very closely to figure out the sources and the methods by which we were able to gather intelligence. And if it was technical, they're going to be looking to plug those leaks, if you will, to plug those gaps, to figure out how the U.S. was able to penetrate and gather that intelligence. And of course, if it's a person, which is if it's a human spy, if you will, an asset that we have working within their offices, well, they're now at extreme risk. And history is replete with human spies having been discovered, and the consequences of that are fairly draconian. Yeah. And the Russians are not shy about torturing and executing spies. For that matter, they'll torture and execute people they just plain don't like. Yeah. So, they have a much lower bar on, well, we don't do that. I mean, we execute, but we don't torture. At least we're not supposed to. I don't want to go back to Abu Ghraib and all that stuff, but I'm just saying that is a big concern. And I'm sure within the National Security Agency, within the CIA and other services, they're looking very closely to see if something's been compromised. Of course, the other fear is if it's a technical thing or even a human asset, they could be, then if they can figure it out, they can turn it around and start feeding us false information. And that's what the Russians would obviously want to do, because they give bad information to us. Their presumption is that we will give that bad intelligence to the Ukrainians, and their hope would be the Ukrainians make some horrific tactical maneuver problem or mistake that leads to some disaster on the battlefield. So everyone is looking at this very closely to figure out how we can avoid that from happening.
Correct. Yeah, a double agent would also be out of the movies as well. Hal Kempfer, thank you so much for joining us. I do have to just kind of bring up here, and I would be remiss if I didn't ask at the end, just based on the fact that the DOD, Brigadier General Patrick Ryder, and the Pentagon taking this so very seriously around classified documents. But classified documents have been in the headlines quite a bit recently, with both former President Donald Trump and also current President Joe Biden, just around classified documents. Maybe how much strengthening do they need to do around these classified documents to make sure this intel, this different information doesn't get out there, doesn't get led astray, because it seems to be in the headlines quite a bit recently.
It needs to be tracked very closely. Of course, I don't want to get into the political nature of what's going on, but the bottom line, you got former presidents, vice president that had classified documents. That's a real problem. All right, they shouldn't have had those classified documents. These documents, there are very strict protocols on how they're handled, how they're stored, where they can be stored, even protocols on when they're supposed to be periodically purged or destroyed from the system, depending on how they're kept. All these things are out there. The rules were simply violated, and we're going to be looking at that very closely. There is another side of this, though, which is, and it's been a constant criticism going back decades, that it's too easy to classify information within the government, federal government, obviously, because that's where the classification goes. And because of that, we tend to classify by default. So we tend to create a lot of classified documents, and we may have created some of the same problems that now we're having a tough time managing by creating such a huge amount of classified documents, by classifying so much information that we create a bit of a tsunami for ourselves, and then we say, oh my gosh, we're in over our heads. Well, that's what happens when you have a tsunami hit you. You have too much going on. So we're going to have to take a hard look at that. But it gets back to leadership. You got to enforce the rules. You got to look at your people. You got to know your people. And when people mess up, you have to hold them accountable. This may be a bit of a stretch, but I would not be surprised to find out at some point that Teixeira was thinking of the Chelsea Manning case, and maybe thinking that, maybe his thoughts are that Chelsea Manning wasn't really held as accountable as she should have been for what happened with the release of documents. That's very possible.
Correct.
All right. There's many of us who probably think that was not handled as well as it could have been. And when there's a perception that it's not that serious a violation, it invites people who have some very odd ideas that, man, maybe I could do that. Maybe I will. In this case, maybe he was trying to impress his friends or something. It's got to be absolutely clear that it's the rules are there for a reason, and the consequences are severe. And that dissuades people from doing things like this.
Correct. Hal Kemper, thank you so much for great perspective, great insight there, national security expert as well. Thank you so much for joining us here again on Live Now from Fox.
You bet. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you so much. As we continue on, I want to give you one more picture out there in Massachusetts as we continue to follow this major story as Jack Teixeira, they're under arrest there in connection with those leaked classified documents.